Okay, well, again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Schack, and I'm Director of Research at Resolution Systems Institute. For those of you who don't know us, RSI is a nonprofit with a mission to strengthen access to justice by enhancing court alternative dispute resolution systems. And we conduct research and provide technical assistance primarily to courts as a way of fulfilling this mission. So for today, I'm going to start us off with a little bit of a background for the webinar and why we are doing this in the first place. And then Stephen Sullivan, our researcher, will take it from there and present. Intermittently, our CEO, Heather Fogg, will provide insights through quizzes because we all know that we learn best when we puzzle through something. And she's stepping in for our research associate, Jasmine Henry, who is unfortunately under the weather today. As we go along, please put your questions in chat, and after each of the quizzes, we will answer your questions. I'll read them out and then we'll try to answer them. So with that being said, we are putting on these webinars because we have seen how communications, like documents, websites, videos, that meet SRLs where they are can make them more confident and eager to navigate an unfamiliar process. And because we know just how hard it is to create those communications that meet people where they are. So this all came about because about 6 or 7 years ago, online dispute resolution was being touted as the next breakthrough in enhancing access to justice, particularly for debt claims. As we all probably know, default rates in those cases are extremely high. And the belief was that a platform that allowed SRLs to address these cases online in the comfort of their own homes and at the time of their choosing, without the complexity of a court process, would lead many more SRLs to assert their rights and negotiate a better outcome for them than default. What happened instead was that ODR programs saw little use and courts began shutting them down. Now, they began shutting them down for a few reasons. It wasn't just, it wasn't just use. It was some functional limitations from the early platforms, some other issues that were going on. But it was clear from our research and from research from others that SRLs didn't have the information they needed to know, first of all, to use ODR and then to want to use it. So we decided that we wanted to undertake some research to find out how SRLs want to be communicated with and what they need in order to get excited and confident about using ODR. So we conducted focus groups, which we gave participants the information they would have received from real courts that were using ODR at that time. And this was information that we thought was from courts that we thought were very thoughtful in the way in which they communicated with SRL. So we thought these were pretty good materials that we were offering to our focus groups. And our focus groups did help us to understand the barriers that do keep SRLs from moving forward with their case and from deciding to use ODR. At the end of our focus groups, we asked our participants whether or not they would be interested in using ODR if they were offered the opportunity. And they were interested. They were excited about the idea of not having to go to court. But when we asked them what they thought ODR was, the only thing they really got was that it was online. They thought it might be hearing before a judge, or they thought it might have been a video mediation, and not the text-based ODR that all of these materials were supposed to lead them towards. And so when we asked them, well, if you would you like to use text-based ODR? They didn't want to use it. They had lots of concerns. And this really comes from this, I think, comes from this idea that if you don't know what something is, there's this big black hole. You're going to fill it with concerns. You're going to fill it with all of these anxieties that you might have about what might be happening within that black hole. So from there, we decided, we created a model communication structure from the first notice that they would receive, say if they had a debt claim filed against them, to registration for ODR. And then we conducted usability testing on the model with people around the country. And at the end of our usability tests, the testers were not only enthusiastic about using ODR, but confident as well. And they all knew what ODR was, and they felt they could easily navigate the process. We had somebody say that they could easily teach their mother who didn't know anything about technology to use ODR, and another one who said, "Oh, my 10-year-old can do this." So the striking difference that we saw between our focus group participants and our usability testers demonstrated to us that effectively communicating with SRLs is essential if we're going to improve access to justice through processes that promise to open up that access to justice. And although our research was about ODR, our approach really is easily adapted to and useful for all court processes. So even if you don't have an ODR program that you're working towards, what we say today is going to be useful and relevant to you. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Stephen.
Thank you, Jen. So as Jen just mentioned, my name is Stephen. I'm a researcher at RSI. So to start things off, I'd actually love to hear more about all of you. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, please introduce yourself, your organization or the court that you're calling in from, and one thing that you're hoping to learn today. And while the answers come in, I'm going to go over what you can expect from our webinar today. So we'll be discussing some of the common communication barriers that SRLs face. And as you all know, SRLs are a significant portion of those who go through the court system, and they must do so with limited legal knowledge. And in addition, kind of zooming out, bigger picture, a significant portion of adults in the US can read proficiently. And the latest data suggests that overall literacy rates have continued to decrease. So this is kind of the context under which we launched the Open project. So today we'll be focusing on barriers that are related to comprehension and emotions. We're actually going to be holding a second webinar on November 12th, which will be about issues related to trust and technology. And Jen will discuss that a bit more later. As we go through the presentation today, we're going to use our open models to exemplify sort of the barriers in communication materials and how to address them. And then throughout, as Jen mentioned, we'll turn it to Heather, who's going to ask us some quiz questions and give us an understanding of the answers. And for those folks who are just joining us, if at any point you have a question, please feel free to toss them into the chat. And after each quiz question, we'll kind of take stock of the questions that have accumulated and go over them as best we can. And then we'll conclude our session today by discussing what you can look forward to next. So let me check back in to the chat. Let's see, we have a lot of folks coming in. People from the Alaska court system, the admin office of Illinois courts, people interested in learning about how to make information digestible and usable, even when someone is stressed and overburdened. Very relevant to what we're going over today, especially that emotional component. Someone else hoping to learn more engagement strategies to get SRLs to consider mediation. Awesome. Also very relevant to what we be discussing. Looking to learn about how to use more real people speak on communicating mediation information. Yes, that's very relevant. Later on, we'll be talking about plain language and how important that is to all of this. Thanks so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. So to kick things off, I'm going to now turn it over to Heather, who's going to give us our first quiz question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So we know that we learn the most when we sort of kind of tickle the brain with puzzling through things. So we wanted to offer these opportunities to learn together. And in our first quiz question, we wanted to check in with you all about what percentage of US adults experience low literacy. Do we think it's 35%, 41%, 57%, or 68%? And we'll give us all a moment to make our choices. We're reaching 90% participation, so we're getting there. So I'll give us just those last few moments if anybody wants to make their final selection. And we'll go ahead and close and share. So, dun, da, da, da. The answer actually is that third choice, 57%. So about 30% of us got that answer correct. Well done. And the reason that we wanted to use these quizzes is just to kind of inform us, why did we do this work? Why did we want to seek out the answers ourselves to some of these questions and to address them? So this percentage, 57% of US adults experiencing low literacy, it comes to us from the 2023 US Survey of Adult Skills, which is the most recent data that we have. The survey divides literacy into 5 levels. And this data shows that 57% of US adults fall within the lower 2 of those 5 levels. They got this result even though 87% of the adults that they surveyed had a high school diploma or above in their education attainment. And so that means that even though a large part of the overall respondents were highly educated, over half of the overall respondents still experience low literacy. And if we look back at past data, we also recognize that this percentage of people who experience low literacy is actually growing year over year instead of shrinking like we may have anticipated or hoped. So this is one of the reasons why we thought it was important to address these questions.
Great. So I'll move us into our first barrier. So this has to do with the stress that SRLs are already feeling. So understandably, SRLs often feel overwhelmed and stressed when they receive a court summons. They often struggle with a lack of clarity in general when reviewing court documents. And research shows that when folks are overwhelmed, they don't take in information. And when SRLs don't have clarity about what they should do next, they're more likely to either not proceed or proceed without feeling confident. And so this doesn't set them up for success. And you'll see kind of in these bullet points here what a basic outline of what this looks like from the perspective of an overwhelmed SRL. We want to avoid that happening because research has shown that stress negatively affects a person's ability to concentrate and to process and remember information. And this was something that was corroborated by our focus groups. We found that participants who worked with difficult to understand materials are more likely to respond to the negative emotions they feel by giving up. So like one participant, for example, said that they would throw out the notice that we provided them. Another said they'd wait for something else to appear to kind of confirm it. And so when drafting your materials, there are kind of two main strategies that can help you address any kind of lack of clarity and the overwhelm and inaction that might come with that. So first, you can provide only essential information. And second, use effective formatting. So what do we mean by when we say essential information here? Users need to know just enough information to know what issues are at stake and how to deal with them. So what they don't need is citations or history or jargon. And they also don't need to know everything about how the process works. They need to be pointed to where to get more information. So the point really is to not overwhelm them. Through research, we also learned that in addition to using only essential information, courts can really benefit from effectively formatting that information for their users for it to be best understood. So what does that look like? What does effective formatting look like? For one, what it doesn't mean is using dense blocks of text or run-on paragraphs or not providing illustrations. Instead, effective formatting means implementing kind of various design choices to address comprehensibility issues. So for example, instead of having all of your information in a paragraph, you should really use questions and answers, fill in the blanks, charts, bullet points. And research has shown that users read better when text is separated into different sections with dividers. White space, the second bullet point there, is also really important for breaking up information, improving readability, and making it more digestible. And materials should also use accessible design, which is something we'll get even more into in our next webinar, which is more about online communications. So now that we have a kind of basic understanding, let's turn to Heather for our next quiz question.
Thanks, Stephen. And I realized I missed an opportunity to share. So as we share some of the sources of the information that we'll be providing, we'll also drop that into the chat box. So I just want to direct your attention there as well. So in the second quiz, here we wanted to ask, true or false? It is okay to use long paragraphs of text, just as long as you bold the important information. What do folks think about that one? We're getting up there to about 91% have responded. So just want to give folks those last few moments to make your selection. And then we'll go ahead and share. So that is actually, as most of us answered, that is actually false. So the idea here, as Stephen was just mentioning, sort of in the formatting and the flow, it is actually not a good idea to use long paragraphs of text, even if you do choose to bold important information, because when conveying that important information, your sentences should be short, like around 15 to 20 words, and your paragraphs should also be short, like just a couple of sentences. If you find yourself in a position where you have a large paragraph with important information and you feel the need to underline words to draw attention to them within a larger group of words, maybe step back and ask yourself if you have too much information in one paragraph. Remembering that each paragraph should only address one topic. And if you have a complicated topic, it's best to use a series of shorter paragraphs to communicate with your user. Because using shorter paragraphs and having more breaks in your page helps to maintain plain language and white space, therefore increasing your material's overall readability. And I'll also share just personally, I've started taking this into account even when writing emails in response to folks who have said things like, when I notice an email that's even more than 2 paragraphs, I don't read it. So this idea of breaking information apart using white space is a tip that I think we all can benefit from. And one more thing that we want to draw to your attention about this question and answer is the part about the bolding. So when you design your materials and try to make them as readable as possible, it's important to keep your formatting consistent and distinct. So you should think about what formatting you're going to use to highlight important information versus what formatting you're going to use for headings, for example. And you'll note that I say versus there because they should be different. We recommend in our guide, which you can access on our site, that you use bold to distinguish your headings. And if you've done that, you wouldn't want to then use bold again to highlight important information inside a chunk of text. So this could confuse your reader, and instead of focusing on what the next steps are in your program, they're thinking about what bolding means in your document. So these are just some of the tips that we've learned along the way and that we're doing our best to implement in our own practice.
Thank you, Heather. Just a reminder for folks too, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat and we'll kind of take stock of them after the quizzes.
Yeah, so we do not have any questions at the moment, but I do want to go back and sort of highlight something that Stephen said a little bit more, and that is the whole idea of when you start out providing information about your program or a process, that it's so instinctive to want to give people all the information in one place. I've talked to many people who have said that, that they've been trying to get their court or their other stakeholders to try to be a little bit less insistent on all of this information, including one person who said they made a video that was supposed to be 3 minutes long, and by the time everyone said we need this information and that information and that information, and it was 12 minutes long. And when you get to 12 minutes long, people are not going to be paying any attention to it or even clicking on it, maybe. So just we need to think about, and we're going to get to this a little bit later, but how much information is needed at the outset and how we can build on that information. Thank you,
Thank you,
Steve.
Jen. Yeah, no, that's really, really critical. So on that note, let's talk some more barriers. So something we found is that many court ADR materials tend to have too much information, often confusing words or phrases, and a lack of clarity regarding next steps. And so we'll provide an example here on the right of what that could look like. So you'll notice in this example, the notice has large blocks of text. It's kind of just a lot of information first glance. And it starts to use white space a little bit at the bottom, but not really where it matters most in the information. Um, and so, kind of taking this notice here, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a self-represented litigant. So, let's say you received this notice here on the right. Um, what would your reaction be? Please put your answers in the chat. We would love to hear what you'd be thinking, what you'd be feeling, or any kind of reaction, kind of imagining that you received this notice. And I'll give a second. Someone said TLDR, too many words. Yep, definitely. Any other reaction? Someone else said that they'd assume it was a scam notice. Interesting. Yep. I'm skimming, trying to figure out what to do, and I don't see it. Yep, exactly. Someone else doesn't explain what ODR is when using it. Someone else, I'm being sued. Scary. Yes, definitely. Awesome. Thank you all. So, um, let's turn to what effective materials should do, and then we'll return to that notice in just a second. So here's some broader goals for effective communication. Your primary goal should be to direct your user and not to educate them. Our focus groups affirm previous research that readers prefer information that tells them what to do as opposed to explaining concepts, right? So they need to know what to do using concise and approachable language. In this case, if legal phrases must be used, it's important to define them early and in easy to understand and familiar terms. And returning to something I discussed earlier, communicating only essential information will really help your users at this point to better understand and work with your program or your process. So once you establish that essential information, that's also where visuals can come into play. So simple visuals can reinforce the information, and the visuals should be incorporated intentionally and provide information that is very clearly relevant. And finally, it's really critical that from the beginning, your materials establish an intuitive workflow. We're going to return to that in just a bit. But first, let's look at the same notice, but now having implemented essential information and effective formatting. So this notice here on the right is our improved notice. You'll see that the updated version here has a court seal on the top left, so addressing some of that concern about scams that was raised in the chat, and certainly that our focus group participants raised. We have question headers, which we recommend over statement headers. There's use of white space to kind of break up the information. You'll see there's bullet points under what is ODR in that header instead of dense blocks of text. And our usability testers found this to be much more approachable and easier to digest. And so this really kind of sets them up from success from the start. So with that, I'll hand it over to Heather for another quiz question.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think this one even came up along the way as we were reading through the chat. So which option is better when drafting communication materials for self-represented litigants? Your two choices here are to keep white space and use multiple pages to communicate your information, or to give up white space and communicate all of your information on one page. Okay, and here we're getting to about 78% of us have weighed in. Give us a few more moments to think about this one and decide which way do we think we should go. All right, 81% of us. So just those last few moments to share your thought. And we'll go ahead and share. So this was a toughie. We recognize that sometimes information that suggests that keep it short and brief, as well as keeping it readable, can come into contrast with one another. And so the answer here is to keep that white space and use multiple pages to communicate your information. And I can really resonate with the contrast and the challenge of this when thinking about even in survey drafting. I know that we've done our best to keep surveys short and brief into one page, and that white space is just critically important. So having and adding white space on your communication materials, whether they're physical documents that folks can handle and touch and use, or websites, things that people are looking at, will increase their readability. So it is best actually to let go of those page limit concerns and to prioritize, if you can, narrowing down the information you want to present, and then presenting that information in the clearest and easiest way possible for your users, which includes using a good deal of white space. Your users are more likely to pick up on and use a multi-page document that is readable rather than a one-page document that is giving them information overload. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Jen, to check in if there are other questions that are coming up along the way. And I'm really glad that this one came up as we were chatting.
Yeah, so no questions, just a lot of really great comments about how they'd feel. And except there is one. Can you provide any citation or additional information where users prefer information that tells them what to do? We can do that. So Stephen, do you want to talk about additional information?
Yeah, so part of that I think also came from the focus groups and was a finding that we came into kind of confirming, and I'll get into this a little bit when we talk about the workflow that we established, but kind of testing, when users are provided information that directs them, they also learn. So it's kind of thinking about that as a process that does both, right? You're telling someone what to do, and in the process, they might not even realize it because it's not so explicit, but they're learning about the concepts that they need in order to proceed. So we'll touch on that a bit when we discuss workflow soon, but it's also something that I would suggest checking out our communication guide for courts, which goes into that too.
Yeah, and it is something that every one of our focus group members said. We want the steps telling us what to do. There's another question. Would it be fair to say that the aim should be to provide practical action over theoretical knowledge, which kind of touches on the same thing?
Yep. Short answer would be yes. I think that would be fair to say.
Yes. Okay.
Great. Thank you all. So now we'll get to plain language, which is something I think a few folks raised as something they were interested in. So using plain language is one of the most important parts of this process. It ensures that SRLs understand the information you're trying to convey, but also writing in this way benefits everyone because it really clarifies what information you're trying to convey and does so in a way that's really concise and easy to understand across all different reading levels. And so why is using plain language so important? People feel overwhelmed and can feel intimidated when information is presented poorly. So people with lower literacy can feel embarrassed if they don't understand the information and may hesitate to continue with the process in that context. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So in this first example, we're trying to give basic information about our ODR program and what it does. So the text here reads, the ODR program was designed to help parties by resolving disputes between landlords and tenants. There's kind of two main issues with this first construction here. First, it uses passive voice, so it's kind of written in a way that uh, obscures more than it clarifies. And it's also written in a way that's kind of unnecessarily difficult to parse out. So let's try to rewrite it to use a more active voice and simpler language. So you'll see in this revised version here, the ODR program helps landlords and tenants resolve their disputes. So in this construction, we use active voice and we also simplify the language. So rather than designed to help parties by resolving disputes between landlord and tenants, we have helps landlords and tenants resolve their disputes. Let's look at another example of another kind of common language barrier. In this example, we want to inform users of the strict deadline to register for ODR. So they have 14 days to register. So in this first text, we have parties who do not register within 14 days cannot participate in ODR. So again, two main issues with this kind of first construction here. The first is that the sentence is not directed to the reader, it's directed to parties more generally. And so SRLs might not recognize that it applies to them and may miss this really important piece of information. And it's also written using what's called negative language. So if you don't do something, you can't do something, right? Let's rewrite it to address these two kind of issues, but also to maintain the same meaning. So in the revised version, we have you must register within 14 days in order to participate in ODR. So you'll see first, it kind of speaks directly to the reader. We're addressing you must do this. And second, it uses positive language. So you must do something so that you can participate. What's important is that this revised version still conveys the 14-day deadline in strict terms, so you're not losing that. But it just makes it easier for the reader to understand and to recognize that it applies to them. And so when you combine plain language with positive language, it emphasizes the benefits of your program to your reader. So with that, let's turn it to Heather for another question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So again, the purpose of our questions is to sort of increase our knowledge by helping us to think through critically some of these things that we're talking about implementing. So please know that if you're answering any of these wrong along the way, you're in good company, and it just means we have room to learn. So here we wanted to check in about how should we, knowing that some of our content is going to include legal terms, how should we use legal terms in our communications? Should we create an attachment with definitions and allow users to reference it? Should we keep any legal terms used to a minimum and define them once and early on? Or should we not use any legal terms and stick just to plain language references? What do folks think? All right, we're getting there in our participation. So we are about 91% have made a choice. So we'll give it just a few more moments for folks to get those last thoughts in. And we'll go ahead and share that here, what we have learned is that our strongest option is, in fact, what many of us chose, to keep any legal terms used to a minimum and define them once and early on. So here, prior research has found, and our focus groups confirmed, and our user testing confirmed for us, that most people are confused by what might be considered to be pretty typical legal terms that our professional legal community uses. So for example, words even like plaintiff, defendant, phrases like sua sponte and without prejudice. Each of these, we recognize we need to be careful when using these legal terms in our informational documents, especially those that are intended for self-represented litigants. So you shouldn't totally avoid using these legal terms because they're important to know, especially if you're referencing court documents that are going to contain these terms or if they're going to be heavily used in court. But we also want to make sure that we're keeping any legal terms to an absolute minimum as much as possible and define them as soon as we can. So if we have to give a legal definition, we also want to try and avoid getting lost in the weeds by reminding ourselves that the goal is probably to direct your user, not necessarily to give them a Latin or a legal education. So you can just provide them with the directional definition in plain language. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jen in case there are other questions that are coming up.
Yeah, I've got two questions. And I've also got a comment that I just wanted to point out because they pointed out something else that we didn't point out in one of our examples, and that is that there was a double negative in our example, and they are so hard to comprehend and so easy to do. um, but we've got a question here. What do you think about using generative AI responsibly without any confidential info to make information more plain language and easier to digest?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I would hesitate to give any definitive recommendations on that, just if only because that's not something we did in our process and we didn't test it. But I guess I would say what would be important to check in that case is that plain language is not just about simplifying language. So it's really about ensuring that there's all these other components to it, like positive language, like I was saying. And so thinking about it as an overall process of tailoring your language in a way that's easier to understand for your audience and for your program is really important. So I think one way, it's something that we did with our materials is usability testing them, and that gave us really rich background from actual users who would be using the program, just to make sure that whatever's being generated is doing its job.
Yes, and Stephen had a great answer to that. I'm going to add in that if you do use generative AI, you can just tell it to say, take this and put it into like something a fifth grader would understand. But yeah, you have to really tell it what to do. It just doesn't happen over like that if you just put it in. And then I've got a question. Do these same rules apply to documents written in language other than English? And I'm assuming all the rules?
Yeah, I would say, again, that's something that not something that we did in our models or tested, but I would say, in the same way that using plain language, positive language for English is beneficial, certainly for other languages too, particularly if that's representative of a user base that would be using your program.
Okay. Got another question. Can you explain or provide a citation about positive language? That sounds great.
Sure, yeah, we can follow up with citations, but to put this back on the slides again, so positive language is about highlighting a benefit to your program that users receive, especially when you're clarifying, requirements, for example. There's a way that we can negatively reinforce requirements, right? That if you don't do this, you're not going to get this. Whereas positive language is about reframing that as the benefit that a user receives from your program, from a process, from participating, while still highlighting and still maintaining that requirement, right? So in this example that we used here, you're still using that 14-day registration requirement and you're still enforcing that really strictly, but you're presenting it as, do this and then you'll get this, as opposed to if you don't do that, you won't get this.
Great. One more question from somebody who said that they're interested in finding out how to do usability testing. Can we share resources about how to do this? Do you want to take that, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. We can definitely follow up with resources. They're also included in our usability test report, which is on our open website. And so we kind of link to resources within there on how to do usability testing. And then We also outlined how we did it for the open project. And one thing I would say is it's a lot easier than you would think. It really only requires 5 users to get really rich and useful data. But I'd highly recommend checking out our open report.
Okay. And just two quick comments about using AI. Someone said Thomas said they tried using AI with suitable prompt to review what they've written to double check their understandability, which is good. And then someone who said that they're running a clerk's protective proceedings manual through multiple AI programs and finds it very helpful. However, it comes with a risk. They often have to correct errors in the legal process.
Mhm.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you all for sharing. With that, now I'll finally get to the workflow, which is something I teased earlier. So plain language and formatting your documents can help to reduce stress, as I said, but let's zoom out to your overall process or the workflow that you should strive to establish with communication materials. So let's again put yourself in the shoes of an SRL who's tasked to navigate these resources on their own. So this is part of a notice that they might receive. You'll see that there's a list here of hyperlinked resources, and there's some problems with this. So for one, it's unclear how they relate to one another. These resources don't really follow a logical order. They don't really establish a series of steps to follow. And just purely on a visual level, it's kind of overwhelming to look at, right? Like if I receive this notice, that's just a lot at once. Um, People need to know how to navigate from one material to the next. And importantly, they have to be able to do so without feeling overwhelmed. So this is where scaffolding comes in. So scaffolding is an educational strategy that's used to break down large and complex amounts of information or instruction into digestible chunks. And so each step builds on the former one. Scaffolding helps you to provide a structure for people to follow that not only enhances their comprehension of the information, but also builds their confidence in the process. So based on our usability testing on our scaffolded materials, we found that scaffolding helped to build not only confidence in our testers, but also help them retain the information better. So by the end of the process, by the end of the session, they knew what to do and were also really able to explain the different components of ODR in an accurate way. Like they were telling us exactly what mediation was and the deadline they have to register by and how to exchange messages with the other party. So on the right here, you'll see some of the benefits of scaffolding. It really helps to clarify your process, and it also sets up your users for success. So here's an example of what scaffolding can look like once you assemble it together. And so these are from the models that we created through the open project and that usability testers found to be easy to understand. So first they start with the notice using the effective formatting and essential information that I described earlier. It tells them how to navigate to the home page, which contains the same information on the notice, but builds on it. So again, they're not provided all the information right away on that notice, and the home page helps to build that out a bit. Then we go to the explainer video, which reinforces this information, but for visual learners. And something that we were really certain to ensure is that the content is same across media types. So you don't have to watch the video to get a full understanding of how the program works, but you may choose to do so if that's how you learn best. And this was something that was also important to our focus group participants that they wanted. Then users can navigate to the self-help guide, which walks them through the process of actually using ODR. And then finally, they can register. And so you'll see here 1 through 5, each material builds on the foundation established from the previous materials in the process. And by the time users got to step 5, they felt much more confident about their situation. Something we periodically asked them was, how stressed would you be feeling at this point? And by the time they got to step 5, there might still be a little stress. I mean, getting sued obviously is not a fun situation, but they felt much more confident in their ability to navigate the situation. Okay, so with that, one more quiz question from Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So based on what we were just talking about, we wanted to reach out to ask, how do you think we can help guide users through the steps of an unfamiliar process? Should we provide them with all the information necessary in every possible communication medium, from printed text, online webpage, video, for example? Should we provide them with different information via different communication mediums? Or should we provide them with digestible chunks of information, repeating the information across different communication mediums? Okay, and as we're getting there to our 88% mark of participation, we'll offer just a moment for any last thoughts. Anybody want to weigh in? Okay. And here again, well done, everyone. So the correct answer is to provide folks with digestible chunks of information, repeating that information across different communication mediums, which many of us chose. And the reason for this is it's important to repeat information so that users have a couple of opportunities to see and take in that information in different forms. However, you don't want to put your users in information overload by giving them all of the information all at once or all of the time. Instead, you want to think critically about your user's experience and your program's process to try to intentionally decide when to provide them with the pertinent information and when to later reinforce that information by expressing it differently on another medium. It's also good to try different communication mediums like hard copy text, web page text, or video, for example, for the same piece of information, because different users are going to learn differently. Different mediums meet different folks' needs in different ways. So that's what makes our third answer the best option. And we also wanted to make sure, as we're closing in on the hour, to make sure that we're catching all of your questions. So I'll hand it right over to you, Jen, for any other questions that are coming up.
Okay. Well, we have no questions about that, but so I'm going to take a little bit of time, just a tiny bit of time, to talk about this. When you scaffold, as Stephen mentioned, the whole idea is that you guide people through what we call a workflow, basically through the information so that they gather more and more information as they go along. And so we set this up, and we had one big issue with our design that we discovered in our first round of usability testing, which was that we sent people to a web page to get more information, but at the top of the web page it said start ODR now with a big button. And so a lot of our user testers just wanted to click on that button and not read all of the information that we provided for them. So one of the things as you think about scaffolding is how you make sure that people actually do the workflow you want them to do, and not you don't accidentally just have them miss a whole chunk. So yeah, that was a big oversight on our part. We were thinking only about, we wanted them to know what the next step was. And yeah, anyway, that was my little story for y'all. Here's a general question. Yay, that gave Anne Marie time to write a question. In creating materials that tell them what to do, is it okay to frame materials as key decisions to make? We are a not-profit, so we do provide legal information and advice, but we want to help SRLs with not being overwhelmed with what to do next. Thoughts? Key decisions to make. Stephen, you got thoughts?
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Um, I think without knowing too much about the context, I think what's most important is to think about what users need to do in order to use your program or use your materials to navigate to what they need to do. in multiple ways. So it's more about the method of the steps that you're providing. And that can go a long way with helping them to not feel overwhelmed. So if there are just sort of like key things that every person needs to do in order to participate in a program or to do a process, then I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Jen, I'm not sure if you have any other thoughts on that, but
No, I think that's good. I think as long as you're being very clear about what you're asking them to do, that is just to call it a key decision is just fine.
mhm.
Two more questions have come up. Um, I'm going to start with a more general one and then go to the uh, more specific. So, when repeating information, should you try to use the same language or change the language to relay the same content? That's a really
Great
good question.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So the answer is using the same language. So if you, for example, like in our materials here as they're laid out, we call it a notice to defendant of mandatory ODR. It would be confusing to then start referring to it, say, as like a document rather than as a notice, because then you're confusing, wait, which one's the document, which one's the notice? And so we found using the same language just makes it very clear what you're speaking about and allows users to, reference the correct information confidently and accurately.
Yeah. And I'll give you another example that's even more mundane. I was reviewing a policy that somebody had written, and at one point they called something a business, and at another point they called it a company. And even I was like, well, it's the business and the company are the same thing. So using the same word is really essential for people to know that this is exactly the same thing that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Um, Molly has a question about whether we have any research on information or materials to provide to landlords, sorry, to help them better engage in the ODR process. Where mediators struggle to get them engaged in the process. And she's trying to solve that problem.
Yeah. Actually, Jen, I don't know if you have any thoughts related to that one, but
Yeah, so I think this is a broader issue than just ODR. It's,
mm,
we have the same issue with our mediation program for eviction. And so yeah, it's a broader conversation that I'm definitely happy to have offline. Um, and I'm just going to put for anyone who wants to contact me, here's my email address. Yeah, because yeah, it is definitely something that we'd have to talk about offline. Um, Another one. Just out of curiosity, did artificial intelligence come up at all in the research discussions for SRLs to be able to understand or feel more confident when feeling overwhelmed? What might be the ramifications of that in our opinion? Stephen?
mm. Yeah, I don't recall it coming up so explicitly during our usability testing, for example, with the exception maybe of this isn't quite getting at your question, but we had a previous vision of a version of an informational video that was played, I think, using an AI voice, and that was not particularly well received. And then um, and then we recorded it with a human voice. But otherwise, in terms of the understanding the information, I'm not sure that it came up during our sessions themselves.
Yeah, I think AI has grown a little bit since we did our sessions.
And
Mhm.
I think one of the things that we've also recently seen is that the folks that we were most curious to ask their opinions are also some of the least likely to turn to AI first
Yeah.
for sort of resolving their questions. So
Mhm.
that's another piece of research that we've encountered along the way that might change over time, but seems to bear out for the moment.
Right, right. All research really suggests that people with lower education levels, people of color are less likely to trust and use AI. Um, you briefly mentioned skipping out on citations, but I live in an area where SRLs face courts with non-attorney judges. How do you balance conveying information to the SRL effectively and providing their the SRL, the tools to help educate the court to find a favorable outcome. Ooh, haven't run into that. To educate the court. Totally not sure. Do you have any ideas, Stephen?
Yeah, I don't feel confident addressing that. That might be something we'll follow up.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't thought about how SRLs educate the court.
Mhm.
Actually, Amelia, there was another webinar that I attended. I think it was a webinar that talked about providing SRLs with tools to go into the court with. Um, and if you contact me offline, I can send you that because I think it's open to the public. Um, I think that's all our questions, and it's 1 minute till. So, yay, we got there. Um, I just want to thank you all again for coming and for being so engaged. It's really, I'm really pleased to have such engagement and so many good questions, comments, all of that. Um, Again, just feel free to reach out to me or the research team at research@aboutrsi.org, and we can talk about things. And then again, please join us on November 12th for part 2 of our series, Creating Trust and Addressing the Tech Gap. And then in early 2026, we're planning on a series of workshops that will allow you to work with us in small groups to create or improve your public-facing documents, your website, your video, or to create a workflow that makes sense to SRLs and improves our understanding and confidence. We will provide more information about those workshops in the email we'll send with the recording and slides from today's webinar. So as you leave, please fill out our survey as you exit. We really do pay attention to what people say. So thank you again very much. And I'm going to end the recording now somewhere.